But yeah, there's some people like on the left who like really love to equivocate between the US and China. Like, you know, they try to frame them as like equally bad sort of imperialisms or whatever. It's like, oh, they're both equally bad, you know, you shouldn't choose between one imperialism and the other, while these are also the same sorts of people who will like, you know, defend the occupation of Afghanistan and to tend to try to frame US imperialism as if it could be like a force for good or whatever, and as if like the problem with US imperialism is that it does bad things rather than good things, like, you know, taking out the correct dictators, as if that's not already the way that it works. And those people like to you know, spat off the talking point that they don't know how to defend at all, that like Chinese hegemony would be worse than US hegemony. Also as if that China and US imperialism are also just as bad as each other, or that like China would be as bad as the US if it could be. And it doesn't really make much sense when you think about it. For one, the way that Chinese imperialism, you know, whatever the fuck you want to call it, Chinese like intervention, Chinese like economic sort of globalism or whatever, like it's the way, essentially the way that China participates in the neoliberal world order is not the same as the way that the US does. Imagine like, say you're a country in Africa, right? You know, say like you've had like 3 or 4 US sponsored coups, a couple of US sponsored proxy wars in the past, your country's been completely destroyed by Canadian mining companies, you know, all that sort of thing. So I can choose between loaning out my port for 100 years to a Chinese company without any sort of additional strings attached, apart from that if I default on these loans, they'll take the port. Or I can get a loan from like the IMF, which is a US proxy organization, US EU proxy organization, with strings attached that say like, you must abolish all labor laws. You must increase the workday from 8 to 12 hours, etc., as a part of receiving the loan. So-called structural adjustments, they call them, in order to maybe develop that port. So you can like essentially be coerced into completely changing the nature of your state by the US, or you can get like a similar sort of loan for this, a similar sort of, not a loan, but rather like a lease to a Chinese company for a similar sort of purpose without having to fundamentally change anything. Which one would you choose? Well, I choose the Chinese one every time, especially considering that China doesn't have the sort of history that the US does in a lot of these countries. And even if they haven't had that history in your country specifically, you know, you can look at your neighboring countries or whatever where they've done this shit and be like, yeah, maybe that's a bad idea. Obviously, the ideal would be that you don't have to take out a loan at all. You don't have to loan a port at all or anything like that. But lamentably, you often kind of have to, unless you really want your results to be extremely delayed. You know, countries aren't like you or me. They can't just say, oh, you know, I'm going to save up money from taxes and then build this thing in 20 years. No, you loan, you build it now, and hopefully you building it that much earlier gives you the capacity to like make enough money off it. You know, you're making so much profit on it that you can pay the interest on it with the profits that you're making. So you don't really lose anything in the end. You basically gain. But the problem is you can get like a loan from China like that doesn't have many strings attached, that, you know, they're upfront with what they want from you. Or you can get a loan from the US, which from the US proxy organizations like the IMF, or directly from the US, which comes with terms like you have to like abolish workers' rights and introduce competitiveness into the healthcare sector or something like that. You know, look up structural adjustments, okay? This is incredibly common. This is the way that the IMF essentially forced neoliberalism on a lot of countries in the third world, especially 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. So, you know, for one, we're not talking about the same sort of thing here. China doesn't have the sort of history of direct intervention that the US does, nor does it ask for the same sort of terms. Does that mean that Chinese imperialism isn't imperialism, that it's good or whatever? Obviously not. The exportation of capital was essentially one of Lenin's top criteria for the very definition of imperialism, and obviously doing that is exporting capital. Now, China does these sorts of loans. A lot of the times, you know, they probably wouldn't be too pissed off if the other party defaulted on the loan, because they're also, you know, they're not just getting money out of it, they're not just getting the interest out of it, they're also getting diplomatic influence out of it. That's another thing, right? China tries to do diplomacy and gain global influence in a way that is obviously far less coercive. It's still obviously coercive, and ideally you wouldn't want to have to get a loan from China or, you know, have any of these sorts of special arrangements with China. But given that your options are basically the EU, the US, or China nowadays, you kind of have to a lot of the time. And China is very clearly the lesser evil in this respect, so to speak. You know, they're not going to intervene. They're not going to coup your government. They're not going to start a war in your country. They are going to try to make money off you, and they are going to try to get you to keep buying shit from them, and they are going to try to, you know, bring you into their sphere of influence. But they're not going to do like, oh, so wait, you can't pay your loan? Oh, time for an invasion. Time for a coup. You want a loan? Well, you're going to have to abolish workers' rights for that, boy. You're going to have to sell every single mine in your country to a US company. There's none of that, okay? And then we get to, like, apart from that, people talk about, like, if China was the global hegemon, everything would be so much worse. Okay, do you have any evidence for that claim? Because even if you're under this delusion that China's system is some sort of incredibly terrible, abominable, 1984 style-esque thing, there's no evidence that China wants to export their system. Not at all, not even close. There is, however, evidence that the US wants to export the worst of the worst sort of capitalism you could ever imagine. Evidence? Have you looked at the last fucking 100+ years of US intervention? It's kind of all right there. And they're open about it too. They flatly admit it all the time. So, you know, there's no evidence of these sorts of nefarious intentions where China wants to impose the 1984 global world order on other countries. Nor is there any evidence that, like, they would intervene and start like proxy wars or just direct wars, as the US has done twice in the last 20 years. No evidence whatsoever. The last intervention by China was in 1979 in Vietnam. Since then, nothing. China absolutely could invade countries, pull off large-scale interventions if they wanted to. Great example, Russia. Russia's power is greatly overstated in global affairs a lot of the time. Russia is an overall pretty poor country, right? But Russia still manages to do full-scale interventions. In Syria, Russia literally invaded Crimea and took it from Ukraine. No problem. You think China couldn't do those same sorts of things if they wanted to? The reason why they don't is not because they don't have the power to do so, it's because they don't want to, obviously. Now, that doesn't mean that China has the moral high ground or anything. It just means they're pursuing a different strategy to get influence. They clearly think, and they're obviously learning from US imperialism here themselves, they clearly think that, like, by being nice, gaining influence by, like, making yourself look like you have a sort of mutual interest in the development of these countries is a much better way to gain influence than it is to just fucking, oh, wait, you elected a leader who we don't like? Off with his head. Or, oh, wait, you have some oil fields and you don't want to sell them to us? Well, looks like your country has a terrible dictator and we need to invade to take him out because if we suddenly care about human rights. There's none of that from China. There's no reason to expect this is going to be either, because if you would expect that they would do more of that in the future, they would already be doing it, but they're clearly not. You know, where's the large-scale China interventions? Where's any of that? Now, some morons would say, well, what about the South China Sea? What about the Chinese border disputes of India? I mean, that's nothing like fucking US intervention. That's nothing like coups. That's nothing like invasions, man. Like, Iraq alone is worse than every single thing that China has done since 1980 onwards. Name, like, one US coup, one US intervention. Eclipses all of China's foreign policy stuff. All of it. Totally eclipsed in severity, in shittiness. And if you want to know why these people, like, why it looks like China is, like, being aggressive with its border disputes or whatever right now, in comparison to, say, the US, it's because the US already settled its border disputes, okay? They did that in the 19th century by literally invading parts of Mexico. Half of the US South is straight up territory annexed from Mexico. The reason why the US doesn't have border disputes in the style that China does right now is because the US settled their border disputes by conquering the territory straight up. Like, I just fucking laugh. Like, that Dylan Burns fucking Lego-headed geek. Like I said to him, okay, could you please name anything like that China does that is even remotely as bad as US imperialism? And he's like, South China Sea, invasion of Vietnam. And I'm like, so how the fuck is the invasion of Vietnam literally more than 40 years ago? And, like, Chinese, like, border dispute bullshit in the South China Sea, even remotely on the same level as, like, the US invading Iraq and killing, like, at least 500,000 people and destroying the entire country, basically. And that's just one example of an invasion. Like, all of Chinese foreign policy together over the last 40 years is not as bad as a single US coup, as a single US war as a single US bombing intervention. So yeah, I acknowledge that China is imperialist, but the idea that the world would be worse off if China was the global hegemon makes no sense at all. It's only based in yellow peril. It's based in this assumption. It's in this completely yellow peril style assumption. It's the same shit as always, right? The entire colonial Anglosphere, settler colonial state Anglosphere has had this primal fear of Chinese dominance for 200 years now. It's never been rational. It's still not rational now. There's no rational reason to assume that China is going to... First thing, China gives you a loan. Next thing, you have to install 5,000 surveillance cameras to control the population like 1984, Xi Jinping, Winnie the Pooh, blah, blah, blah. The sorts of things that these people believe. There's absolutely no rational indication to believe that would ever happen, that they want to do this anywhere. China doesn't impose their political system on other countries. They try to make money off them. They try to gain influence in them. They try to bring them to their sphere of influence, but that's not the same thing as imposing their political system. The US imposes political system by overthrowing governments that it doesn't like, and literally installing puppet governments like that of Afghanistan, which we just saw how much of a puppet that it really was by the fact that literally no one thought that it was worth defending. It's basically just like complete yellow peril. They believe that Chinese people are basically automatons and they want to assimilate the rest of the world like the fucking Borg. That's where this comes from. It's US exceptionalism and it's racism. Even people who consider themselves on the left, a lot of them, I've spoken enough about the US left for you guys to know my opinion on it, the Vorsphere. That sort of thing. People who legitimately seem to believe that it's a good thing for the US to maintain its influence, its hegemonic influence over the world, and that China challenging this is a bad thing. Now, obviously, an ideal world wouldn't have these sorts of imperial powers, jostling for influence. But as long as they do, if China can take some of this power from the US, it's a good thing for the world, okay? It's a good thing. That's a simple fucking fact. Because it's going to be way better to get a loan from China than it is to get a loan from the US and then have the US coup your government and invade you if you can't pay it, or, try to seize sovereign assets if you can't pay it, or whatever the hell. It's better to be aligned with China and trading with China than to be aligned with the US and trading with the US, ensuring that if your people ever elect a leftist government, it's immediately going to get couped. If you want to know why countries are aligning with China more, why more countries in Africa are aligning with China, why more countries in South America are aligning with China, etc., etc. It's because these countries have been fucked over completely by the US. Even if you are a straight-up imperialist masquerading as a leftist who wants to pretend that you genuinely care about the other countries of the world, you should learn from China's strategy and say, this is what we should do instead. Get rid of 80% of your military and put that budget into giving loans to other countries so that they can build roads and shit. Not putting fucking conditions in there that they basically turn into a free market capitalist political system. Try that. Learn from China instead of acting like China is being doing some nefarious shit by learning from your mistakes. I honestly don't believe what I just said, by the way. I'm talking in a sort of liberal, moronic liberal sort of way, in a way that I hope they would understand. So yeah, the idea that Chinese and US imperialism are both equal is stupid. And this doesn't mean that you need to side with an imperialism. It's just an acknowledgement of reality. You're going to be better off if you sell a fucking mine to China than if you sell it to Canada or the US right now. That's just simply how things are. You're going to be better off getting a loan from China to build a highway than you would if you got it from the IMF. You're going to be better off overall, because that China's not going to fucking invade you. That it's not going to coup you. That it's not going to force you to do things that are far outside of reason, at least far outside of being reasonable as what the US does. And it also doesn't have any of the history that the US does of doing these things. It really makes me laugh, for example, a lot of people in Bolivia try to frame the mass party as they talk about how they were against America, but then they align with China. Well, they align with China because, they have to get loans from somewhere, and they don't want to get them from the US because, the US has kind of just supported a coup against them 2 years ago, if you didn't notice. So kind of rational, I would say. I think it's pretty rational of them to not trust the US and move over towards the other global power that, while not ideal that you need to align with them, certainly nowhere near as bad as aligning with the fucking USA, man. There's no possible way to say that Chinese and US imperialism are just as bad as one another. Obviously, the US imperialism is far worse. There's no Chinese Iraq, there's no Chinese Afghanistan, there's no Chinese coups, nothing like that. All the things that you can point to, the shitty things that China does that you can point to, just like the South China Sea, that sort of thing, absolutely pale in comparison to just any random fucking thing that the US does as if it's routine. So yeah, hey, imperialist leftists in the USA, you might want to work on your exceptionalism a little bit and start acknowledging reality. You guys voted for Joe Biden as a lesser evil, so it might be time for you to acknowledge that in terms of imperialist powers, China is clearly the lesser evil now. Not just that, but it will also be the lesser evil in the future if it does become the world #1 imperial power. Because there's absolutely no indication that it's going to be anywhere near as destructive as the US has been in its position as the #1. Okay? Simple facts. I know you don't like it, but it's true. The reason why you don't like it is basically just because most of you are racist. Even if you don't know it. Sorry.